I did something very simple that still brings joy to my heart. A man walks into a restaurant, sitting down eating lunch. He says, "Do you have a phone here?" I said, they said no, and no public phone. And he says, "There's no public phones around here because they've all been taken out because people have cell phones." So I heard cell phones. Oh, I have a cell phone. So I said, "Here's the phone." And he calls disability transport.
Wow.
And so I said, "Sit down, can I buy you lunch?" He said, "No." And he said, "Did you hear about the fire on Wabash Avenue?" And so and then he goes into a story how he's rescued and he's living at the YMCA and how he ended up in the hospital,
Wow.
Being rescued from the fire. And so he gets up and leaves, and then I go to pay my bill, and then like the 320-somethings come up to me and said, "Oh, we're going to buy you lunch today."
Right.
And it just made me feel good, but
Yes.
I think they felt good too.
Exactly. And that's this remembrance. You watch the news or you read the news or you have your normal interactions in your workplace. It's not a bad thing, but we are not encouraged to engage these actions. And that means that when we do, they're really, really potent. I mean, that was a really powerful example. You never know how powerful your selfless deed is going to be and then what effect it's going to have on those who witness. And it generally has effects like that.
Yeah. Now, I'm aware that you went to law school and you're working on the Innocence Project.
Well, I did go to the ego self Scaughdt. Went to law school,
Okay.
which he still comes up every now and then. That's true. That was another guy, but that was part of my past. And I have not recently worked on one of the Innocence projects in Chicago, but I have last year I did engage that as a service. Yes.
Okay. And can you explain to our audience what the Innocence Project is?
I can indeed. There's a civil rights firm in Chicago, Lovey and Lovey. Mm-hmm. And one of the facets of their law firm deals with attempting to get wrongfully convicted prisoners out of prison, which in our society, in any society, is quite the noble cause. And so I wouldn't accept money for my services, but it was one facet of law where I feel very, very comfortable in assisting. I thought it was a very powerful service. Yeah.
Yes, and didn't Lovey and Lovey help get people off of death row, people who are convicted of murder waiting to be executed out of prison?
That is possible, but I do not know if that is actually the case or not.
Well,
that's what they're attempting to do.
Yeah.
And it is not easy. Yeah.
Yeah, I think they represented some of the people that were incarcerated in the Burge police torture case.
That's quite possible, yes.
Yeah.
I would not be surprised. Those were not the cases I was working on. But,
well, let's talk about this a sec. How does somebody who's been in prison for 20 years unjustly for a crime they didn't commit turn into a peace program?
Wow. How would they?
Is it possible for someone to forgive like that?
Oh, yeah. Of course. It's difficult. We all have our challenges in life, and everyone has a set of challenges, and some are, in certain situations, more difficult than others. And I would imagine that if you had been falsely accused of a crime and falsely imprisoned for 20 years, that's a pretty difficult set of challenges to then become a forgiving, loving person. And I have seen it happen. And when it does, that person becomes that much more powerful in their forgiveness because they have suffered so greatly. You look at many of the great men and women, and they are the ones who have suffered and who have loved anyway. Gandhi gets shot and expresses love for his assassin.
He would sit nonviolently and accept a beating.
I mean, how the Dalai Lama deals with the Chinese government, for example, is a wonderful case. It is possible. And these people are not genetically different from you and I. They are merely making unusual, courageous choices that we all can make.
Well, and I think of Nelson Mandela, who spent 25
The list is long.
Years
It's surprisingly long. It's not a list you would see necessarily on the news, and yet the list is long, and at every person I meet, I realize the list is a lot longer of really great, noble people than we give it credit for. One thing I'd like to mention about the whole prison system, falsely accused thing, in my perspective, this may sound a little extreme, and yet it is a truth that I've been living. Everyone in prison has been to a degree falsely accused. And because I've experienced the truth that the only way to rehabilitate a criminal is to take away the impetus they have to hate themselves And it is typically self-hatred or anger that had them committing the crimes that put them in prison in the first place. And condemning them to punishment, fair or not, psychologically never removes that reason for their original crimes.
Well, and that brings up the whole prison system. Is it to punish or is it to rehabilitate?
Right. And I'm not saying, I think there are programs out there that are doing rehabilitative work, and they're based in forgiveness. There are several groups that are going into prison working on getting the inmates to forgive themselves and to ask for forgiveness from their quote-unquote victims. And it's leading to beautiful results. And if those kind of programs don't come into play, I think the recidivism level, where the people are released and commit other crimes, is high. And in my opinion, it's not because these people are genetically criminal. They're just not receiving the unconditional love and acceptance as human beings that would allow them to stop self-hatred behaviors, self-loathing behaviors.
Do you think a psychopath or a sociopath can be rehabilitated? And
I don't think they need to be. I know what you mean. I don't want to play semantics. Yes, and I'm not alone there. Fortunately, people a lot smarter than me. Number one on the list, Viktor Frankl, who developed logotherapy, did work with psychopaths and sociopaths. And
alcoholics and drug
the
addicts.
list is long.
To people who are chronically depressed.
Had amazing success. And for those who don't know, Viktor Frankl's, I'm no expert, but his fundamental premise is if you give people a renewed sense of meaning, i.e. service, if you awaken to them to this selfless path, that they can do something good, that their psychoses or their neuroses very quickly dissipate, even if they're really extreme sociopathic conditions. And
what Frankl would say, meaning from the suffering, because Frankl knows about being falsely imprisoned because he was in prison in a concentration camp.
Yep, he was.